Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 200, Educating Ourselves. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And this is our look-back episode on our long series on Jewish education and learning. It's also our celebration for our 200th episode. And for that reason, we've invited on, actually for both reasons, we've invited on our old friend, Benay Lappe. She was, as you'll recall, our very first guest ever on episode 3, and she's also been on Judaism Unbound 2 other times, specifically episodes 36 and 56. So it's been a long time, but welcome, Benay. It's great to have you on.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So just to remind everybody a little bit about who you are, and I'll do it really short because we've done this 3 times already. Benay Lappe is the founder and Rosh Yeshiva of Svara, which calls itself a traditionally radical yeshiva. That is an organization that focuses on Talmud study through the lens of the queer experience. Since we talked to Benay probably about 3 years ago, it's hard to believe, Svara has really grown and flowered and does all kinds of new programs beyond what we talked about way back then, but it includes now week-long queer Talmud camps in the summer all over the country. They're still continuing with their 6-week study programs that they were doing back then, but now in 14 more cities, because Svara has also been operating a teacher training program, which has led to 14 people being out there around the country being able to use Svara's method to offer study programs in their own cities on their own. Those programs aren't exactly run by Svara, but they're inspired by the Svara methodology. So it's really clear that this is growing and spreading. And Benay, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on, because clearly this is a success story of Jewish education. So we're excited to have you here. And before we jump into our conversation, I just wanted to mention that there's another important thing coming up. For those of you who are focused on giving charitable donations before the end of the tax year, we wanted to note that that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And since this is our 200th episode, usually we say maybe you would want to give $1 for every episode that you listen to. So if you listen every week, you might give $50 or so. If you listen occasionally, maybe $18. And we'd still say that, but if you want to really make this special, perhaps you might consider a gift of $200 to celebrate our 200th episode. And thank you so much for your support of Judaism Unbound. It really means so much to us. And the way that you can donate is go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate. So now let's jump into our conversation. And this is really meant to be a conversation among the 3 of us. So Benay, you jump in whenever you want. But Lex, I'll start by just kind of remarking that, when I look back on these conversations about Jewish education, there are all kinds of particular insights that have jumped out. And also what I've realized, and I think I realized this early on in the series, but to my chagrin, I don't think I realized it before we started the series, that when you're talking about education, you're really talking about the thing itself in very deep ways. And I'll just give you one example with an episode that we actually didn't consider to be part of the series on education initially, but in my view, it really was the first episode about education because it really framed the whole thing. And that was our interview with Sarah Hurwitz, who people will recall, she was Michelle Obama's speechwriter. And after finishing her service in the Obama administration, she took a Jewish studies course and all of a sudden got interested in Judaism in a way that she was not interested based on her childhood Jewish education. And what really struck me was, when she talked about how she was really taken, I think it was the first day of this adult class that she took, and they presented to her this idea that Judaism fundamentally is grounded on the idea that everybody is created in the image of God. And she was really taken with that idea. And she had never heard it before. And my initial response is kind of like, oh, what a sucky Jewish education where she never heard that before. I mean, that is an important idea. And how could it possibly be that Jewish education for children for all these years doesn't mention it? And maybe that's something that's missing. But it also occurs to me that maybe there are certain ways of opening Judaism up that really only register for adults. And that got me thinking about the possibility that what if we're thinking about it all wrong, that we tend to think about Jewish education as something that's for children and maybe some adults will do it. But what if we thought about it in the opposite way altogether, that Jewish education was something for adults? It suggests that actually the thing itself might change, because if Jewish education is fundamentally focused on adults, then perhaps the transmission of Judaism is also focused on adults. So what would a world look like if we thought about Judaism as being something that's transmitted from adult to adult rather than something that's transmitted from adult to child?
Yeah, and I want to give the first of what might be, we never know at the beginning of an episode exactly where we're going to go, but what might be many like back out umbrella moments, which is, so you use the phrase "the thing itself" a few times, and I think it's like a phrase that is worth defining. But what we're talking about when we say the thing itself, we're talking about how often in Jewish life we think about, organizations changing, we think about people starting up X, Y, or Z, new Jewish ritual, new way of doing Jewish holiday, new organization, institution. And sometimes there's a presumption that doesn't mean Judaism, like the thing itself, there it is changing. It just means that we've got a new way of accessing that thing. And a lot of our points on this podcast stem from a basic presumption that Judaism, to the extent that such a thing even exists, but like Judaism is maybe always changing, but certainly right now in the midst of transformative change, to the point that Jewish education, how we educate, whether it's children or adults, not only is a way of transmitting Judaism, an existing thing, to people, but is itself part of a process of changing what that thing is. So how we teach about it, who we teach Judaism to, whether, by the way, that's adults versus children. It's also Jews versus not Jews. We talked a little bit about that in this unit. Is Jewish education just education to Jews? Is it broader? How does that manifest? So I just wanted to define that. Now, I really want to own the adults piece that you brought up, because that was a theme, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, of this unit. And also we're here with Benay, who does incredible work. Is it mostly with adults or is it entirely with adults?
It's primarily with adults, but we also teach teens.
Cool. Okay. So I think that's great. And I think that a lot of the most exciting developments I look out and see in Jewish life are catered towards adults. And I think on some level, even I'm not saying this just about others. I think even I kind of discount them sometimes. We look at, Sefaria. Sefaria is an organization, they do actually operate. They're a digital organization that houses all sorts of Jewish texts. They provide opportunities to make source sheets to use in Jewish education sessions all around the country. And they actually do manifest in a lot of classrooms with a lot of children. But the origins of that organization were about adults accessing Jewish texts, opening up the set of people who would be able to look at, X, Y, or Z text from whether it's 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, and apply it to their lives in a Jewish way. If we thought that Jewish education was primarily something that happened at adulthood, because after all, adulthood, for most people, God willing, is most of life. So I guess like Benay, we've thrown out a lot of sort of abstract thoughts here. What's your read on that? How do you think about this question of adult education versus children's education?
I think the sophistication of the tradition is something that you need at least a teen to appreciate.
You need to be a teen to appreciate it, you're saying?
I think so, at least. Having said that, the fact that we're not teaching, for example, the concept of svara to kids, I think is an enormous loss. The idea of svara, it's a 2,000-year-old concept, which means essentially moral intuition. And it's the idea that one's inner voice, when refined with learning and having been steeped in the texts and principles and values of the tradition, is actually equal to Torah in its authority and can trump Torah. Basically, you can trust that inner voice to be a voice of God, even more trustworthy than what it says in black and white in the Torah. Now, if someone had taught that to me as a kid, my life would have been completely different. And when I had felt that the inner truths of who I was were in conflict with the tradition when I was coming out as a queer person, I would have thought, no, I'm not an abomination. That piece of Torah isn't right about me. My inner voice is Svar, and my tradition privileges that voice and says that's actually the voice of God, and more important, can be more important or overturn Torah. You know, we teach a lot of things to kids in Hebrew school. We teach them Shabbat and Tikkun Olam and Tzedakah. We should be teaching them Svara. If we can keep kids trusting the tradition with concepts like that, maybe we can hang on to them until they're old enough to get the really good stuff. And I also want to add that I noted that when Rebecca Milder, in one of the earlier podcasts in the series, was talking about the Jewish Enrichment Center, she talked a lot about getting stuff inside of kids, getting the prayers inside of them, getting the melodies inside of them. And I think that's really important too. And I'm not sure, quote unquote, Jewish education is the best way to do that. But there's some authentic experience of the melodies and the prayers and what it feels like at the Shabbat table. That's probably the best way to do Jewish for kids. Let's get them to continue to trust the tradition, believe that it's smart, till we get them in the Beit Midrash. And I'm thinking about something that felt like a theme coming up in a number of the interviews in this series, which is the people on the margins saying, Jewish education ought to be thinking about people like me. Sarah Hurwitz saying, it's people like me. And what's really interesting is it used to be, all of us in the queer community who felt like we were the only ones on the outside. We were the only ones on the margins. I remember in rabbinical school thinking, only those of us in the closet about our gender or sexual orientation were in closets. Turns out that pretty much everybody was in some closet. And a whole bunch of people who look like they're comfortable in the mainstream of Judaism feel like outsiders. And, what I think you've pointed out in other episodes, Dan, is that the tradition in the early stages, in the first couple of centuries of the rabbinic era, when they were taking a wild shot because they had nothing to lose about what the tradition was going to look at, there was a disproportionate number of converts and children of converts in on that project. And I think that's not an accident. And I think it's not an accident that, what I would call option 3 Judaisms today are disproportionately populated by converts, people who are not Jewish, people who are interested, and not sort of held back by nostalgia or held back by a pediatric version of Judaism.
Yeah, I really appreciate the points you're making about folks who are converts, marginalized in other ways. I think that's so, so key. And I think it relates to a word that's been coming up that you've each used, not in some terrible way, but a word, sophisticated, that I kind of want to highlight and question a little bit, not because you meant it in any sort of mean-spirited way, but I think that sophisticated, like it implies kids aren't sophisticated. And I don't want to pretend that kids in every way are equivalent to adults. I hope, a decent enough educator that when I work with, a toddler or a preschooler, like I'm not treating them the same way I would treat somebody much older. But there is a way in which when I work with, even an elementary school, late elementary school, early middle school student, I try to treat them like I would treat a person, like I would talk to a friend, like I would talk to an adult. And I find that actually tends to go pretty well. And more than that, like the teachers who taught me best, and this is the real point I want to make about converts, marginalized, etc. Like it's not the people who knew the most. I think we have this idea that people have to like know the beast, like know all the material of Judaism in order to teach it. And it's like, people don't need to know all of it. They need to have an energy. They need to have a certain amount of access to Jewish material. But if they don't know everything, but they bring a passion and energy and excitement, that's the key. And I'm not saying the word love here kind of intentionally. I've said over and over on the podcast that I don't want the core focus to be on teaching emotions, on like teaching that, we love Israel. We love this holiday. We love, as Jews, X, Y, or Z. I think that it arises sometimes when you teach it, but I don't want it to be the focus, but that's a side point. But more than that, I think that when we see kids as sophisticated and not as like packages that we have to mold, like these little humans that we have precious time that we must pack all the Jewish facts and figures and stuff into before they are bar mitzvah and we're never going to see them again. Like, if we see them as really capable to the point that we could have bigger conversations, energizing conversations about what is Judaism? Why do we care about it? I think that's where powerful learning and energy can happen. I guess like what a shame that we see bar mitzvah. I mean, this is a reality sometimes, unfortunately, but like what a shame that we treat bar mitzvah as this endpoint before which we have to fit all the stuff, and not as a beginning point. Like I wish we could transcend that.
The fact that we don't imagine bar mitzvah as a beginning is because we have reserved and isolated the most sophisticated, the most nuanced, the most complex, the smartest version of Judaism for the 1%. We've said, you know what? It's going to be good enough for us if just 1% of our population gets the really, really good stuff. And as far as I'm concerned, that stuff is in the Talmud. That's the how it works, the how to make it work when it fails. It's the instruction manual for radicals. It's like, Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. That's what the Talmud is.
Another good Jewish text.
That's right. That's right. And the truth is, we've done pretty well for 2,000 years with just 1% of our population knowing it. But that's over. And I think it was based on a misunderstanding all along, which was that the other 99% couldn't handle it, couldn't handle the complexity. What we're trying to do at Svara is to take that material that we've given to 1% of the population and bring it to the other 99%. I also want to say a couple of other things. I agree with you completely that expertise is over as a prerequisite for education. Pamela Grossman is someone who has begun to get at the idea of subject matter expertise actually not being predictive of educational success on the part of the teacher. And I found that to be absolutely true at Svara. When I started Svara, I had some big highfalutin ideas about creating players, but at the end of the day, I really wanted a place for me to learn. And I wanted other queer folk to come into the room so that I could have a sandbox to play in with other people like me, and I could relax and just be me. And so I wasn't really invested in being the teacher. I was just learning along with them. And what we discovered was that that's an amazing formula for great teaching, as Dan calls it, being the public student. In fact, if someone has a PhD and is like super expert in Talmud, they will never, ever teach it at Svara. They cannot. Because what I want is for the student to look at the teacher and say, that could be me. That's who I could be. I don't want them to look at the teacher and say, I'll never be that. They're so smart, I'll never be that. That is disempowering. So I'll stop there. I also disagree with you, Lex, about the whole love thing. For us, love is a big part of it.
I want love to be I want love to be a result. I don't want it to. There's more to say there, but
yeah, there's more. We'll put a sticky on it.
Well, I think that what you're saying now, Benay, helps me segue to a related but different idea, which is also, again, I mean, I'm not trying to push this, but it keeps striking me that every time we talk about a different element of education, we're also talking about actually a change to Judaism itself, or a modification at least. So the thing that I think is interesting is like when we say it used to be the 1% and now it's for everybody. So, we're talking about a layer of Jewish education, a level of Jewish education, that which was restricted to more or less the people that we've known until now as the rabbis. And what's interesting is that as Yitz Greenberg talks about the changes from one era of Judaism to the next, right, that we move from a hereditary priesthood, right, the only way to be a priest is to be born a priest. And then we move to this expansion of a rabbinate that is authorized, right? Somebody in authority deems you to be expert enough that you can also be authorized and then you can deem others, etc. And the question is, like, what does it look like when we're in this new era, which Yitz Greenberg talks about? It's the lay people, it's everybody. On the other hand, a lot of people, when I say things like that, will say to me, but not everybody wants to. My little correction to that is it's everybody who wants to, right? Meaning that the choice becomes so we move from heredity to authorization to choice. And then the question becomes, how do we get somebody to choose? I mean, why would somebody choose? And I think that gets to what you were saying earlier about expertise versus, like, let's say the teacher as expert versus teacher as public student. Because teacher as expert tends to be against choice, push it, right? Because you say, like, oh, I can never be that expert, so I could never be at that level, so I guess this isn't for me, so I'll get whatever I can learn here, but then I'm going to go off and do something else, and I'm intimidated by that teacher. And not only do I think that I can't be a teacher, but I barely think that I can be a student, right? Unless I'm some kind of superstar, as judged by that teacher. And that's a very disempowering, as you said, or whatever the opposite of choice is. It's like a magnet repels as opposed to attracts, right? And an attraction, right, is saying, like, oh, this person who seems like I would think that they know a lot. I mean, they've been to rabbinical school or whatever, but they're saying they don't know either. Well, that's actually kind of exciting, right? I'm attracted to that. I go back to Sarah Hurwitz and what she was saying about, right, that I think that that the way that Jewish children's education has been largely oriented until, let's say, recently, has been around the way that Simon Sinek frames in his TED Talk. Simon Sinek has this TED Talk where he talks about organizations generally talk about what they do, the surface level, and they don't talk enough about how they do it, their unique ways of how they do it, and even less about why they do it, their deepest, why do we even exist? And I think that when we think about Jewish education, it tends to always be, especially for children, about the what. So Hanukkah's coming up. Tell me about Hanukkah. Well, we light candles and we play dreidels. These are all the whats, as opposed to saying, tell me about Hanukkah. Well, let me tell you, Judaism fundamentally is built on this idea that because we were slaves and because we were oppressed, we have a sacred duty to never let anybody else ever be oppressed again. Now, how does that have to do with Hanukkah? And then you say, well, in the case of Hanukkah, maybe it doesn't always. And then we're like, oh, we have to actually change the what of Hanukkah in order to make it more connected to the why. But I want kids to be saying, that, right? Like, I don't understand why we're lighting these candles. What does that have to do with strangers being oppressed? And then that puts pressure on us to make sure that the what corresponds to the why. But instead, we're always kind of talking about the what. And if we can figure out some kind of Jewish value that's a expression of, then great, that's bonus, as opposed to saying, that we should always be educating out of the why. So if we always talked about Judaism as, here are the three things that it's really always about, and they're so cool, then everything else would sort of flow from that. I think you would get more choice makers, would be my hypothesis.
I want to take that one step further. The why is not only important, you have to take it a step further and say, why is this compelling for me personally? Anyone who transmits any part of the tradition has got to make themselves visible. They have to say, this is why it matters to me Benay, me Dan, me Lex. I'm going to quote Pamela Grossman again, whose work on orientations was really foundational for then the work done by Barry Holtz and John Levison, who laid out different orientations to teaching, why we teach what we teach. And what we've realized at Svara is that you have to let your students know what you believe about what you're teaching and why it matters to you. That's enormously important. I mean, just think about educational settings you've been in where teachers have taught subject matter and you had no idea what they believed about it, why they thought it was important, or why it was personally meaningful to them.
Yeah, I think the why point is really important, and it flashes me back to Erwin Kula coming on, and he talked about, there's a whole slew of whys, WHYS, that you could have for various Jewish projects, he gave either one or two, but one exception that he says you cannot have in this era of Judaism moving forward, but unfortunately a lot of people do have, which is we exist as an organization to like make more committed Jews or make people who care more about Judaism. And that motivates so much of Jewish education, and it's such a huge problem. And if there's one thesis, I think, if there's one thesis statement that I'm coming away with from this Jewish education unit, it's like, we're not in this to like make people care about Judaism. That's not what this is for. I mean, I also would like that, but that's not the primary why. And I'm thinking too, for me, what is the paradigmatic text of Jewish education? We don't always talk about it as Jewish education, but I think of Pirkei Avot, which, you know, it's in the Talmud, it's in the Mishnah, which it's, to quote Darren Kleinberg, a different episode of ours, it's not about Judaism. They don't say, there's rabbis being quoted in this left and right about their thoughts of the universe. And none of them says, you know, hey, Shabbat is precious, mark Shabbat. They don't say, Passover's really great, mark a Seder. It's if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? To quote Hillel, it's not on you to complete the work, but nor are you free to desist from it, to quote Rebbe Tarfon. It's all these aphorisms that, like, you could quote them to somebody who's not Jewish and they wouldn't know they're Jewish. And by the way, that happens. Like, people are quoting Emma Watson as if she made up the quote, if not now, when. And by the way, I kind of like that. Like that's the point. Like, we should be creating pioneering teachings in our universe that speak to the world. And so for me, the why is much closer to that than anything about Judaism so much. Now, I do want to form Judaisms that are designed to achieve that. And I think that there are ways to do that, and that's an important thing. But for me, the end results and even some of the beginning pieces of Jewish education are not just about Jews. Like, we use the phrase Jewish education. I called it like a one-syllable word at one point in this unit. People say Jewish education. And we talk about it as, it's obviously, we don't break it down this detail, but like, Jewish education is the realm where we like educate Jews about Judaism. And like, I'd prefer to think about Jewish education as education that is Jewish. Now, what that means, we could talk about and we should talk about that. But I think that another paradigm shift that we could adopt and that would automatically change how we take on the tasks of Jewish education would be if we said to ourselves, okay, this has to speak to anybody in this room, whether they are Jewish or not. What Jewish pieces do we then prioritize? Which ones don't we? How do we do that? Which ones? And then we, in my view, get Pirkei Avot. Even though it was designed by Jews for Jews, we get something like that that has the potential to speak to the world.
I want to take a stab at a slightly different take on what do we mean by Jewish education. I think Jewish education is education in service of the kind of human being that the entire Jewish enterprise exists to create. And we actually have a clear understanding of what this is. It's kind of ridiculous that we don't talk about it more. It's a human being who is deeply empathic, who is connected to others, who can tolerate paradox, contradiction, uncertainty, complexity, so that they can move through the world in a mature, responsible way and create a liberated world. I'm glad you brought up Erwin Kula, because before I learned all the academic lingo about orientations, I had Erwin in my head. And Erwin used to always say, he's one of my teachers, he used to always say, you got to have a take. You got to have a take. And he's right. You have to be about something. You have to know what you're about, and you have to make that transparent to people. I think that's something that we've gotten right at Svara. It's not just Talmud for Talmud's sake. It's Talmud in the service of creating a certain kind of person in order to create the world in which, as Yit says, is one in which all human beings have an equal chance to be their fully human selves, their best fully human selves. That is a world without the barriers of prejudice and disease and war and poverty which will allow them to do that. So you have to know what you're about.
And I think fundamentally, I guess I want to test whether we all agree with this. It feels like fundamentally, one of the things that we're saying here is that Judaism is not an end in itself, and it shouldn't be. And it seems that perhaps because of fears of assimilation and other kind of fears, that Jewish education, for the most part, has been built around a notion that Judaism is an end in itself, and our goal is to make sure Jews are doing Jewish. And that defines the education. How can we, as Hillel once said, Hillel, the organization, not the person. And this actually is like the opposite of Lex's version of Hillel, right? Because Hillel, the organization, had a catchphrase at one point to maximize the number of Jews doing Jewish with other Jews. And what we're saying, I think, is that two things, right? One, Judaism is a means to an end. That end, as you defined it, Benay, is to cultivate a certain kind of person, which itself is a means to an end and an end in itself, but it's also a means to an end to make sure that those cultivated people contribute to a better world. And that is the end in itself, right? That is the end. And I think what we're saying is two things in all this, right? Number one, Judaism is a means to an end, is a toolbox. And number two, the toolbox isn't working all that well right now. And so what we're saying is that something has to be repaired and, updated, but don't get confused that what you're updating is some kind of thing that's going to be worthy of participation because of its own glory. What we're looking for is something that will be repaired so that it will truly live up to that mission. And that's where we get back to the why. If the why is Judaism exists in order to cultivate a certain kind of human being who will then go and contribute to making the world a better place, I think that gives us much more of a roadmap to saying, okay, we have to investigate every single piece of Judaism and ask ourselves, is it doing one or both of those things? And if not, what do we do?
That's right. And then you no longer have to be attached to the forms, because the old forms, the old ways, the old technologies for creating that kind of person they're negotiable. They always were negotiable. I'm certain the rabbis would not care if Shabbos was on Saturday or Wednesday, or if Shabbos didn't look anything like Shabbos and we came up with something even better than Shabbos, something better than all the practices that we have. They were very willing to change the form, but they kept their eye on the ball. They kept their eye on the kind of human being that they were trying to create. And I think you're right. If we keep our eye on the ball, we're going to be much less attached to the forms that no longer work and say, okay, well, let's play. Let's think of how we can make this kind of person.
Yeah, I guess I want to poke a little more at the Talmud and like its place in Jewish education, because I both completely, super deeply accept that the Talmud has all of the potential that you're talking about, that it is possible to utilize it in ways that are super empowering and radical and what our world needs. Fully agree. And I want to question its centrality a little bit. Not that it can't be central for some people, but that treating it as sort of the classic or one of the classics of like Jewish material that we have to cover in Jewish educational settings. Like I want to think about it, because there's lots of other realms of Jewish experience that I'm not sure we privilege as much. And like, to take the unit we're about to enter into, Yiddish culture, Yiddish literature, I think that we think about, Torah, Talmud, all of those pieces as like, you have to have that. And sure, we'd also love to cover cool things like Yiddish. I mean, to not be so Ashkenazi centric, also Ladino would be an awesome thing to teach, and stuff about the Jewish diaspora in general all around the world. People get that would be nice, but I think it's sort of like the cherry on top. And the Torah and the Talmud, and I think differently, but like the Holocaust, those are like the must-haves. And the rest is like, yeah, we do that when we can. And maybe Jewish holidays are also the must-haves. And I question that. Can we do some of the empowering, awesome work with these classics with these pieces of Jewish tradition that have garnered all sorts of commentary, that are sort of in the center. And just as we're trying to empower new people who have been marginalized, the 1%, the 99%, excuse me, can we also try to do some demarginalizing work for elements of Jewish tradition, like pop culture, like sports? That's an area I love, of course, but can we do some of the work that would place those in more Jewish education classrooms as real sites of Judaism, of Judaisms, of Jewishness, whatever, and also find ways to take on those classics like the Talmud in a really sacred way?
I mean, I guess my question about that, Lex, is I don't disagree with the basic premise that it's not all about classic Jewish texts. For sure, I agree with that. But I guess my question is, can we make a distinction, or should we make a distinction between what we might call high culture and low culture? But I would say that that maybe that's not also a good phraseology for it, because that's not quite what I'm saying. But I think that I guess in my mind, right, the notion that we are a people, or I shouldn't even say we are a people, because I am imagining Judaism as evolving beyond we are a people. But this is a project. This is a group of people who have chosen to be part of this group because we love to build our society around the idea that some kind of ancestors of ours, right, were slaves in Egypt, or we reenact that every year so that we ourselves were slaves in Egypt. And our takeaway from that is no one should ever be oppressed again. To me, that's different in category than sports and Judaism.
I want to be clear. For me, it's not. But
yes, I understand that. Going. So that's what I want to sort of understand, because to me, it's like I am imagining a Jewish future in which people are choosing to be Jewish, right, or choosing to make that a priority in their lives. I think that we can distinguish between, and maybe my examples were not the right ones, but I think we can distinguish between, something that has been a core value for thousands of years, and that, if it's still good, versus something that is fun.
Yeah, mostly the answer is no. I don't make a distinction, and I want to explain why, because it relates to earlier pieces, and I get that it may sound trivial to people when I say we should place the intersection of sports and Judaism on a level playing field with the Talmud. I want to talk, I've mentioned sports and Judaism as a realm. I'm going to do a little brief, to me, the reason why sports and Judaism matters, what Jewish athletes do and don't do in their lives, how they manifest Jewishness, how they don't, how the patterns of our calendar year in Judaism parallel the patterns of a calendar year for a deep sports fan, how all of these, to me, they open up incredibly deep conversations. I'm not here for the ooh, look, Sandy Koufax is Jewish. I'm not arguing that the fact of Sandy Koufax not playing baseball on Yom Kippur one year is to be centered to the extent that the quote by Hillel the Elder, which I love, should be centered. Do I think that we should look at 20th century Jewish experience in the realm of athletics and ask, why did it matter so much that Max Baer, a boxer, wore shorts with a Jewish star on them in fighting against a German in the 1930s? Why did it matter so much to people following baseball around the country that they would root for the Detroit Tigers because a guy named Hank Greenberg was on that team and publicly speaking out about being a proud Jew, once again in the 1930s? What does it mean that as the century evolved, we see disproportionate Jewish overrepresentation in basketball in a time period when they're living disproportionately in urban environments? How does that make us rethink the idea of Jews as upper-class suburbanites eternally, and think about what that would mean for us in having empathy for groups who currently are more likely to be overrepresented in urban environments? What do we think about gender when we see that Ali Raceman is, by most definitions, probably the most successful current Jewish athlete, but probably isn't prioritized as much as, say, Ryan Braun, a Major League Baseball player who has steroids on his resume? All of those things are sports and Judaism for me that are really big, and they are, to accept part of your point, they are civilizational questions on some level. They are questions that are built on a frame that is not just Judaism as belief, as sort of, and I know you're not saying Judaism is these beliefs, that it's, but that it should stand for something. It should have a take. And these pieces are not necessarily just about Judaism having a take. They're deep though. And I want to make clear to me, And I've talked in other contexts about Rugrats Hanukkah and how, to me, Rugrats Hanukkah should be on the same playing field when we talk about Hanukkah in contemporary Jewish life as dreidel, as gelt, as candles. Like, to me, the fact of human relationships to an experience of being represented on television for the first time, there is exactly one mainstream Jewish holiday program, Jewish holiday show, Rugrats. They did 2 specials, Passover and Hanukkah, that is widely known to millennials, and it's Rugrats Hanukkah. And it holds like a deep weight, a religious weight, I would argue, for people. It's an interfaith relationship. It's an interfaith family. What does it mean that in athletics, in all of these realms, we see so frequently a higher representation of those on the margins than we do in Jewish institutions? What does it mean that there's more Jews of color who are athletes and actors? Tiffany Haddish just had a beautiful, she called it a black mitzvah. What does it mean that when we look at pop culture and sports and all of these realms, there's way more of the people who are queer, who are on the margins, than when we look at our Jewish institutional spaces? What does that mean we should feel an obligation to learn about those? That's what I'm getting at. And to get it back to Jewish education, I think that the reason those have to be on the same playing field is because people need to feel that this is their story. When I look at, even me, I'm in rabbinical school, and when I look at the rabbis, I sort of feel that it's my story, but I also feel like it's not. I feel like the people that they occasionally kvetch about who aren't following all the rules are as much my story. And that's not the only thing the rabbis stand for. I don't want to sound crap, but I feel like I stand as much for the people that rabbis occasionally kvetch about as I do the rabbis. And I want to feel all of those people as part of my story, which is a little bit a peoplehood orientation, I guess, but I don't think it's just necessarily tribal. I think it's because it opens up possibilities for values-based thinking that we all would agree on.
I think that's really interesting, and I'd want to pursue, whether it's later in this episode or at a later time, the question of, if that's true, then where's the Jewish education? Where does Jewish education fit into that? Like, is there a missing element of Jewish education? Right? What would a Jewish education look like that educated folks through some of those types of ways of being Jewish, right? Because it kind of feels like the world, what you're pointing out in a certain way is that the world of Jewish education, what's called Jewish education, really is situated for that other material, and we have no formal educational work being done for the stuff that you're talking about. And if what you're talking about really is at that level of importance, then you would think that we should have some kind of educational endeavors that are oriented towards that.
I want to jump off of what you were saying, Lex, about we have to get people to see that this is their story, or have Jews see that this is their story. We have to take it much further than that. We have to collapse the distance between the rabbis and us, between the architects of the tradition as we know it and us, so that we can see ourselves as architects of whatever the tradition is going to look like in the future. We can't be satisfied that people see the rabbis as their ancestors. They need to see themselves as the ancestors of the next Jews. One of our slogans at Svara is, we are Chazal. We are the rabbis. We are the sages of blessed memory. Meaning we have to look at ourselves and imagine that in the future, they're going to look back at us and say, wow, they were responsible for creating this amazing system, thanks to which we exist and we've made this kind of world. If we don't see ourselves that way, we're in trouble. And I think that's the project of all of the successful option 3 Judaisms out there. We're in business to get a new team on the field, to activate a new generation of Gedolim, of greats, of people who not only are seen by others for what they can contribute and have contributed, but who see themselves that way. And what makes a Gadol, what makes a great person, is going to be very different in a time like ours than what made a Gadol in the past. Although I think it's really similar to what made a sage or a great person in the early rabbinic era. Remember, those guys didn't go to rabbinical school. They didn't know Talmud. There wasn't any Talmud. They knew very little. They had a little bit. And they were able to make a lot. I think this gets back to your knowledge versus chutzpah curve. I think Svara's project at the end of the day, and it will be this for the rest of my lifetime, it's to activate, inspire, empower a new group of folks. Not all of them are going to be Jewish either, who are going to see themselves as players, as shapers of the tradition, who are going to be invested in a tradition that's really great and needs to be made even better, and who will stand in their queerness, in their profound experience of otherness on whatever plane, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, whether it's because of disability, whether it's because they're people of color in a racist world that has granted them powerful, valuable, crucial insights that need to be brought to our tradition.
My question, or what I'm thinking about, is, and here I'm going to put our podcast in the realm of Jewish education, which is not where it started in my mind. And over time, it's become clearer to me that it's fair to call what we're doing Jewish education. In part, it wasn't in my mind because I was so clear on how we were students. We were studying. We were not educating. We were being educated in many ways. And then over time, I've realized that that's actually a very powerful way of doing education. And so then my question is, like, what are we trying to educate about? And when you're saying that the goal is, to get a new team on the field, I agree with that. I actually think that we have to have two new teams on the field. The two teams that we want to get on the field is like one team of creators, players, experimenters, whatever we want to call them. And that's going to be an expanded group. It's going to be larger than the number of rabbis that we currently have or have ever had, but smaller than the number of all Jews. And there's another team on the field who are the people that participate in the things that group puts on the field. And I guess when we're talking about education, I'm thinking, what does education mean in terms of both of those teams? And my question is kind of like, how do we say to somebody, look, if we're saying Judaism is a little stuck, there's some repair that needs to be done. What is it that attracts those folks to say, hey, I'm really interested in reimagining Judaism so that it can accomplish those things, versus I'll just go build something else, or I'll go join something that, already exists? Or, is it that nothing else really exists? Is it Judaism has raw materials that are especially good? Is it that at the end of the day, we are likely to be talking to people who have grown up Jewish because there's some nostalgia? But I guess my question is, like, what is the attraction? That education seems like a two-step. First step is that you have to be attracted to put yourself into the educational environment, and then step two is what happens next, which is most of what we've been talking about. But what do you think about that step one?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. I think folks need to be attracted to our project. They have to be attracted to the ultimate goal of the Jewish project, which is the creation of this particular kind of human being. And every tradition creates a certain kind of human being, a very different kind of human being. And I actually want all of our traditions to be really successful at creating the conception of the ideal human being that they think is the best one, because all of us together are going to be doing a great job. So that's the first thing that's going to attract people. Another thing you're getting at is that the stuff of what Judaism looks like is very much in flux. And I don't think we can sell people on what it looks like, because what I want to be saying is it's all up for grabs. When I say I'm interested in getting a team on the field, what I'm also saying is I'm hands off to what they do once they're on the field. I have no attachment to how they do Jewish, whether they do it this way or that way. I think we've talked before, and it's come up on your podcast in numerous interviews, the idea that when your tradition is working, you teach the content. When you're in a crash, when you're in a time of enormous change, you don't teach the stuff, because you're just teaching stuff that doesn't work and is going to alienate people. You teach how the tradition can be changed and the mechanisms of change. What's most Jewish about Judaism is how we respond to crashes. We have great, great technologies for that. The Talmud is the handbook for how to make your tradition better when it crashes. And I think that's a very attractive offering, which is useful for lots and lots of traditions. People come from other traditions to ours to say, hey, we're crashing. You guys know how to deal with crashes. Teach us how to do that.
Yeah, I love what you're getting at with the, Judaism has this vision and other traditions have theirs and they should all succeed. I think there's a deep truth to that. And we're at our 200th episode. First off, we never thought we'd get to 200 episodes. And so it's a cool, fun thing for us to be at 200 episodes. Second, I want to get a little mystical, and people will forgive me, hopefully. The number in gematria, in Jewish numerology, that is associated with 200 is the third to last letter, is Resh. And when I think of the word Resh, I flash actually to somebody from the Talmud. That Benay, I know you have a relationship with this character because we've learned some of his thoughts before together. Resh Lakish. So
I dress up as him every Purim. That's all I do every year. I'm Resh Lakish.
That's amazing. And more than that, I'm going to argue that you are Resh Lakish the rest of the year too, through what you do with Sfar. But that's where I'm getting at. Resh Lakish is a really amazing character, not just because he's, one of the rabbis that is discussed and does discussing in the Talmud. Resh Lakish grew up, and notably, this is marked specifically, he grew up as a gladiator. He was a fighter. He was in many ways the kind of not typical, marginal person that we're hoping to see rise, all three of us, in Jewish leadership. And so I wanted to end this unit on Jewish education and this sort of reflection on where we are with the podcast and saying, let's be and let's together form Resh Lakishes. And whether you're a Jewish educator or not, let's say, wow, it's not Resh Lakish didn't become an awesome commentator of Jewish text despite his background as a gladiator, as a fighter. I mean, I'm not endorsing going and fighting, by the way. That's not the point here. He didn't become this incredible central person in Jewish text and lore despite his background that wasn't typical, that wasn't, learning all the text, etc. It's because of that on some level. He came with an outsider's lens, and that gave him a set of tools and abilities that only made him more powerful. So my hope is that we can do that and get those players on the field. And Benay, I'm curious to have you wrap this up, and if that resonates, if you can comment on it or just go a different direction.
Yeah, I love that you brought up Resh Lakish, because he was also, some commentators say, a highway robber. He was like a bandit. And, when I went to rabbinical school to learn Talmud, rabbinical school, at least at JTS, wasn't open to queer folk. And I went into the closet to Robin Hood the Talmud from the folks who said, no, this belongs to us. This doesn't belong to you. This isn't yours. But like Art Waskow said years ago, we all stood at Mount Sinai. It actually belongs to every one of us. And I'm all for Robin Hooding the tradition and the tools of the tradition from those who would keep it for themselves and give it to those who we're going to put on the field to create a tradition that, as I've said elsewhere, may be unrecognizable to us. You put all that together, you get, things like I've fallen in love with my tradition. We didn't set out to do that, but that's what happens when people are loved in a place of love and have reason to love the tradition.
Thank you so much, Benay, for joining us as a guest appearance, but also as a guest co-host today. I mean, it's been fun, thinking out loud about how we can get those players on the field.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun, and it is such an honor to have been invited back, especially for your 200th episode.
And thanks so much to all of you out there listening. That feels like a really important thing to say. We say it every episode, but we're 200 episodes in, and just genuinely, fully, completely, entirely, we would not still be doing this if it weren't for you. We would not just be talking into thin air if we didn't care very deeply about our relationship with all of you listening. So thank you. Even if this is your first episode ever, thank you for listening. And if this is your 200th episode ever, thank you also. This is a crazy project that we embarked on that we never thought would make it this far. And it's just through the support of you and through, frankly, the emails and the comments and all of the questions that you've sent our way that we continue to have material to work with, that we continue to have new ideas for what we could bring to this show. So thank you. We want to close out this episode, this amazing return episode with Benay Lappe, and our unit of episodes on Jewish education in the same way we close out every episode, which is by asking for some more of that, by asking for some more comments, questions, thoughts, etc. from you. And there's a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com, lex@JudaismUnbound.com, one or the other, both, whatever you would like. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation you're able to send our way. And you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. And as Dan said at the top of the episode, because of this 200th episode, if you're able, I know it's a bunch, but if you're able to do a $200 donation in our honor, that would really mean the world to us and go a long way towards helping us sustain this moving forward. One other little note, we really hope that you'll continue on this podcast journey with us moving forward. We've got a couple great episodes. I'm going to roughly call them about Jewish creativity. There's a lot more there, and we hope you'll listen to learn out what the there is. But that's sort of an umbrella term for our next two episodes that will close out 2019. And then we will be diving deep into Yiddish, into the Yiddish language, into Yiddish culture, into Yiddish history. We're talking to some really great people about just a huge web of topics that come up when we look at Yiddish, when we look at language more generally, when we think about diaspora, Jewish culture, all of this stuff. And we're excited to do that. So join us. With that, this has been, and will continue to be, Judaism Unbound.